The bold and the beautiful, where every celebration carries the weight of secrets, rivalries, and unexpected revelations. Will Spencer's birthday was never going to be just a simple gathering of cake and candles. It was destined to become yet another unforgettable chapter in the tangled lives of the Spencer, Forrester, and Logan families. The sun poured through the massive windows of the Spencer mansion that morning, casting golden light across the elegantly decorated living room where balloons, carefully chosen in Will's favorite colors, floated gently near the ceiling. Katie Logan had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure her son felt loved, safe, and surrounded by family, despite the emotional turbulence that always seemed to follow their lives. Bill Spencer, determined to put aside his usual intensity and focus solely on his son, had even canceled meetings, something nearly unheard of, while trying to convince himself that this day would be free of complications. But in Los Angeles, especially among this circle, peace never lasted long. As guests began to arrive, the mood was warm and lively. Laughter echoed through the house as familiar faces filled the room, family members, close friends, and even a few surprising attendees who hinted that something more than just a birthday was about to unfold. Will, growing older and more perceptive, couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was in the air. He smiled, accepted hugs, and thanked everyone politely, but his eyes occasionally drifted toward the door, as if he were expecting someone or something specific. Katie noticed it too, her maternal instincts quietly alerting her that her son was anticipating a moment that hadn't yet arrived. Meanwhile, across town, Dylan stood alone, staring down at a carefully wrapped box in his hands. Unlike the extravagant gifts that typically accompanied Spencer family celebrations, this one was modest in appearance, wrapped in simple paper with a ribbon that had clearly been tied and retied several times in nervous hesitation. For Dylan, this wasn't just a gift, it was a risk, a statement, and possibly a turning point. His connection to Will had always been complicated, layered with unspoken truths, emotional distance, and a longing for acceptance that he rarely allowed himself to fully express. Today, however, everything felt different. Today, Dylan had decided he would no longer stay in the background. Back at the party, Bill raised a glass, delivering a heartfelt speech that caught everyone slightly off guard. Known more for his commanding presence than emotional vulnerability, he spoke about Will's growth, his kindness, and the pride he felt as a father. Katie watched him closely, touched but also cautious, knowing Bill's sincerity often came wrapped in complexity. As the room filled with applause, Will smiled, but once again, his attention flickered toward the entrance. And then, just as the moment seemed to settle into comfortable celebration, the door opened. Dylan stepped inside. The room shifted almost instantly. Conversations quieted, glances were exchanged, and an undercurrent of tension rippled through the guests. Dylan wasn't exactly unwelcome, but his presence carried history, complicated, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. Katie's expression tightened slightly, while Bill's eyes narrowed with curiosity and suspicion. Will, however, reacted differently. His face lit up, not with shock, but with recognition, as though this was exactly the moment he had been waiting for. Dylan approached slowly, his steps measured but determined. Every instinct told him this was a mistake, that he was walking into a room where he didn't fully belong, but something deeper pushed him forward. When he finally reached Will, the noise in the room seemed to fade into the background. "Happy birthday," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion beneath it. Will smiled, genuine and warm. "You came." There was something in those two simple words that shifted everything. Dylan handed over the gift, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before letting go. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it means something." Will looked down at the box, then back up at Dylan, sensing the weight behind it. Around them, the room held its breath. Even Bill, usually impatient in emotional moments, remained silent, watching carefully. Slowly, Will unwrapped the gift. Inside was something no one expected. Not a gadget, not something expensive or flashy, but a deeply personal item. A framed photograph, slightly worn but clearly cherished. It showed a much younger Dylan, standing beside someone whose presence immediately sparked recognition and questions, a connection, a history that had never been fully explained. Will's expression changed instantly. "This is," he began, his voice trailing off. Dylan nodded. "It's part of the truth," he said quietly. "A part you deserve to know." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in whispered confusion, shock, and realization. Katie stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in, while Bill's jaw tightened as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even realized existed began falling into place. "What is he talking about?" Bill demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. But Dylan didn't look at Bill. He kept his eyes on Will. "It's more than just a birthday gift," Dylan continued. "It's a beginning. Or, at least, it could be." Will held the photograph tightly, emotions swirling, curiosity, confusion, and something deeper, something that felt like a truth he had always sensed but never fully understood. Katie reached for her son gently. "Will, maybe we should." "No," Will said softly, surprising everyone. "I want to hear this." And just like that, the celebration transformed into something else entirely. Dylan took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back now. There are things about your past, about your family, that haven't been told completely. Not because people wanted to hurt you, but because they were afraid. Afraid of what it would change. Bill stepped forward, his authority undeniable. "If you have something to say it clearly." Dylan finally met his gaze. "I am." What followed wasn't just a revelation. It was a moment that would ripple through every relationship in that room. The truth Dylan carried wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was real. And in a world where secrets were currency, truth was the most dangerous gift of all. As Will stood there, holding the photograph, surrounded by family, tension, and the weight of something life-changing, it became clear that this birthday would never be forgotten. Not for the decorations, not for the cake, but for the moment everything shifted. Because in the end, Dylan hadn't just brought a gift. He had brought a truth powerful enough to change everything. The silence that followed Dylan's words felt heavier than any argument that had ever erupted inside the Spencer mansion. It wasn't loud, explosive drama, at least not yet, but something far more unsettling. The quiet realization that a truth long buried had finally found its way to the surface. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, moments like this didn't just pass. They reshaped lives, redefined loyalties, and set the stage for consequences no one could fully control. Will's fingers tightened around the photograph, as if letting go might somehow erase whatever truth Dylan was about to reveal. His eyes searched the image again, tracing the outlines, the faces, the subtle familiarity that tugged at something deep inside him. "Why does this feel like I've seen it before?" he murmured, almost to himself. Dylan took a careful step closer, lowering his voice. "Because a part of you has always known," he said, even if no one ever said it out loud. Katie's patience snapped. "That's enough," she said firmly, stepping between them. "You don't get to come in here on my son's birthday and start speaking in riddles. If you have something to say, you say it clearly or you leave." But Will gently touched her arm. "Mom, please," he said, his voice steady, but filled with quiet urgency. "I need to hear this." Katie looked into her son's eyes and saw something she couldn't ignore. Determination, yes, but also a need for answers she hadn't realized had been growing inside him. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back. Bill, however, wasn't as willing to yield control. "You're walking a very thin line," he warned Dylan, his voice low and dangerous. "So, whatever game you think you're playing, you better end it quickly." Dylan shook his head. "This isn't a game," he replied. "Not for me. Not for him." He glanced at Will again. "And definitely not for you." That last line hit harder than anyone expected. Bill's expression darkened. "What is that supposed to mean?" Dylan hesitated for a fraction of a second. The last moment, he could still choose to stop, but then he exhaled slowly and let the truth come. "It means there's more to this family than you've allowed him to believe." The room stirred again, tension rising like a wave about to crash. "What are you saying?" Katie demanded, her voice now trembling with a mix of fear and anger. Dylan gestured toward the photograph. That picture, it wasn't taken randomly. It was taken on a day that mattered. A day connected to Will in ways none of you have ever fully explained. Will swallowed hard. Connected how? Dylan's eyes softened. Because the person standing next to me in that photo isn't just part of my past, he said. They're part of yours too. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Bill stepped forward again, this time unable to contain himself. Stop talking in circles, he snapped. Say it. And then Dylan did. That person is the reason our lives are more connected than anyone here wants to admit. The words landed like a shockwave, but instead of immediate clarity, they brought confusion, layered, complicated, and deeply unsettling. Will looked between Dylan, his parents, and the photograph again, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you saying we're family? Katie's breath caught. Bill didn't answer, and that silence spoke volumes. Dylan nodded slowly. Not in the way you might think, he said carefully, but close enough that it changes everything. Katie shook her head, backing away slightly. No, that's not true, she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. If there was something like that, something that important, we would know. Dylan's gaze didn't waver. Would you? He asked quietly. Or would it have been easier to keep it hidden? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Will turned to his parents, desperation creeping into his voice. Is he lying? Katie opened her mouth, but no words came. Bill's jaw clenched, his silence, now less about control and more about calculation. And in that moment, Will understood something terrifying. There was truth here. Maybe not the full story, but enough. You knew something, Will said, his voice cracking as he looked at them. Didn't you? Katie finally stepped forward again, her eyes filled with emotion. Will, listen to me. No, he interrupted, shaking his head. I've listened my whole life. I want answers now. Dylan watched this unfold with a mixture of regret and resolve. He hadn't come here to hurt Will, but he had come knowing that the truth, once revealed, would hurt anyway. I didn't bring this up to destroy anything, Dylan said. I brought it because he deserves to know where he comes from. All of it. Bill let out a slow, controlled breath, as if deciding something internally. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried weight. There are things, he admitted, that we chose not to discuss. Not because they didn't matter, but because we believed it was the right decision at the time. Will stared at him. For who? That question cut deeper than any accusation. Bill didn't answer immediately. And again, the silence said everything. The party, once filled with laughter and celebration, had completely transformed. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or leave, witnessing a deeply personal unraveling that felt both intimate and explosive. Will looked down at the photograph one more time, then back at Dylan. So this is my real birthday gift? He asked quietly. Dylan nodded. It's the truth, he said. Or, at least, the beginning of it. Will exhaled slowly, his world tilting in ways he hadn't expected when he woke up that morning. A beginning, he repeated. But in the bold and the beautiful, beginnings and endings were never simple. And as the tension thickened, alliances shifted and long-buried secrets clawed their way into the light, one thing became undeniably clear. This wasn't just a birthday anymore. It was the moment everything changed. Will stood in the center of the room, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands, as if the weight of it had suddenly multiplied. The air felt tighter now, harder to breathe, as though every secret ever buried inside the walls of the Spencer mansion had decided to surface all at once. In the dramatic universe of the bold and the beautiful, revelations didn't simply change a moment. They rewrote destinies, and Will could feel his shifting beneath his feet. No more half-truths, Will said finally, his voice steadier than anyone expected. If this is really about me, then I deserve the full story. Not pieces. Not hints. Everything. Katie closed her eyes briefly, bracing herself. She had always feared this day might come. Not in this way, not like this, but the past had a way of refusing to stay buried forever. Will, she began softly, there are things about your past that were complicated. Painful. We thought protecting you meant keeping certain details hidden until you were older. I am older, Will replied, his voice tightening. And this doesn't feel like protection. It feels like I've been lied to. Those words hit Katie like a physical blow. Bill stepped forward, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping through his fingers. No one lied to you, he said firmly. We made decisions, as parents, to give you a stable life. Dylan shook his head immediately. Stable built on silence isn't the same as truth, he countered. And he's smart enough to see that now. Bill's eyes flashed. You don't get to define what's best for my son. Maybe not, Dylan replied, his voice calm but unwavering. But I do get to tell him the part of the story that involves me. Will turned back to Dylan, urgency rising again. Then tell me. No more build-up. No more mystery. Just say it. Dylan hesitated, not because he didn't want to speak, but because once the words left his mouth, there would be no taking them back. He looked around a room, at the faces filled with tension, fear, and anticipation, and then back at Will. That photo, Dylan began slowly, was taken on a day when two lives crossed in a way that changed everything. You were too young to remember it, but it mattered. More than anyone ever admitted. Katie's voice broke through, sharper now. Dylan. No, Will interrupted again, more forcefully this time. Let him finish. Dylan nodded, grateful for the permission. The person in that photo wasn't just someone I knew, he said. They were someone deeply connected to your family. And what happened that day created a bond, a connection, that didn't just disappear, no matter how much people tried to move on. Will's breathing grew uneven. So you're saying my life, my family, it's all tied to something no one told me? Dylan met his gaze. Yes. Katie stepped forward again, tears now visible in her eyes. We didn't tell you because we wanted you to have a normal childhood, she said. Free from the complications, the mistakes, the consequences of choices that weren't yours. But they still are mine, Will said quietly. If they affect who I am, then they're mine whether you told me or not. That level of clarity, of emotional maturity, stunned everyone in the room. Bill ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling between anger and reluctant acceptance. You think knowing everything will make things better? He asked. Sometimes the truth just creates more problems. Will didn't hesitate. Then let me deal with those problems, he said. At least they'll be real. Dylan exhaled slowly, realizing that this moment, this exact moment, was why he had come. Not to fight, not to prove anything to Bill or Katie, but to give Will the chance to understand his own story. There was a time, Dylan continued, when decisions were made quickly emotionally. People thought they were doing the right thing, but those decisions had consequences that didn't just go away. They shaped relationships, changed paths, and created questions that never got answered. Will looked down at the photo again. And I'm one of those questions. Yes, Dylan said softly. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't just tension, it was realization, spreading from one person to another. Katie wiped a tear from her cheek. We were going to tell you, she insisted, though her voice wavered. Just not like this. Will gave a small, sad smile. When, he asked. Next year? 5 years from now. Or never. She didn't answer. And once again, the silence spoke louder than any words could. Bill finally stepped closer to Will, his tone shifting, less authoritative, more human. Everything we did because we love you, he said. That hasn't changed. It never will. Will nodded slowly. I know, he said, but love doesn't cancel out the truth. That simple statement landed with undeniable weight. Dylan watched the exchange, feeling both like an outsider and someone deeply tied to the moment unfolding. I'm not here to take anything away from you, he said to Will. I'm not trying to replace anyone or rewrite your life. I just didn't want you to grow up feeling like there was something missing without knowing why. Will looked at him carefully. And now? Dylan gave a faint, uncertain smile. Now you get to decide what all of this means. Across the room, the untouched birthday cake sat as a quiet reminder of what the day was supposed to be, a celebration, a moment of joy. Instead, it had become something far more complicated and far more real. Will glanced at it briefly, then back at the people around him, his family, Dylan, the guests who had now become witnesses to something deeply personal. This was supposed to be simple, he said. Katie managed a bittersweet smile. Nothing in our lives ever is. Will let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no real humor. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. He looked at Dylan one more time, holding up the photograph slightly. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Dylan nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. And in the ever-evolving world of the bold and the beautiful, beginnings like this didn't come quietly. They came with consequences, with questions, with emotional storms that refused to settle. Aswell stood there, no longer just a boy celebrating a birthday, but someone stepping into a deeper, more complicated understanding of his own life. It became clear that the real story wasn't the party, or even the revelation itself. It was what came next. Because now that the truth had been set in motion, there was no stopping what it would uncover. And for Will, for Dylan, for Katie and Bill, everything was about to change.